So first of all, I'm humbled and honored to be speaking to you all here today. Really excited to be going over what we have ready for you guys. First off, as far as introductions are concerned, my name is Robert Herrera. I'm a senior security consultant at NCC Group's hardware and embedded team. Presenting alongside with me here today is Alex Plaskett of NCC Group's EDG. So the talk that we have here for you today isn't necessarily just the Wi-Fi portion itself. It's really just sort of an overall effort that we've put into the Sonos devices as a whole. So we'll be going over the Wi-Fi exploitation portion on the Sonos One Gen 2 and the secure boot stuff that we have for you guys here today on the Era 100. So let's jump into the Wi-Fi exploitation portion on the Sonos One. A little bit of background. Why did we even attack the Sonos One Gen 2 via Wi-Fi? So NCC's EDG had previously done their own research. They'd essentially done their research for the sake of a pwn-to-own entry. This basically led to them discovering their own vulnerabilities and really just coupling that with existing research from researchers like Blasty and Synactive, which led them to ultimately being able to dump software off of the device. And that's kind of basically where the start of Wi-Fi, or at least the interest in Wi-Fi, began. The Wi-Fi driver was basically one of the kernel modules that was within this software, within this firmware image. They kind of did a sort of a holistic review of all the kernel modules and noticed that on the Wi-Fi driver, the kernel module was compiled without stack cookies, which is great. So that's kind of where I stepped in as a sort of subject matter expert with the Wi-Fi as far as where we go from there and how we attack it and if we can find any bugs in the actual kernel module itself. Sort of jumping forward as far as like what that led to in terms of results, ultimately we did find a bug, obviously, and the Sonos released their own respective fix for that in roughly fall or winter of 2023, and MediaTek, which is the respective kernel module's Wi-Fi stack implementation, was released in just recently in January 2024. So before we actually look at the sort of cool Wi-Fi stuff, let's do a little bit of a background on the device itself. So obviously, if we're going to want to debug this in real time, let's see if maybe UART is enabled. Turns out it was exposed. TX basically was really fruitful in the sense that we got boot logs and sort of fast forwarding here a bit, we also get kernel panic output, which was really helpful for the sake of exploit dev. RX, we weren't necessarily too interested in. It was disabled. U-boot was password protected, and basically everything after the initial boot screen showed nothing, and we weren't able to interact with it. And then lastly, this Wi-Fi implementation, as far as what it looks like, it's not an integrated chipset. It's actually a Wi-Fi card that's connected over PCIe, so effectively just Wi-Fi communication, talking to the OS over your PCIe bus. So again, we were able to take software or firmware images off of these devices at this point. So the first things first, as far as sort of the attack surface and what it is that we had to deal with in terms of security mitigation, the first thing that we noticed when we extracted the kconfig was that config randomized base was disabled, which is really nice because we don't have to deal with KSLR at that point. Next thing, again, stack canaries weren't enabled. These are ART64 ALF binaries, so we'll be dealing with a 64-bit address space. Lastly, again, as previously mentioned, this is a soft stack implementation, which is really just a fancy way of saying that the state machine, all of the message handling within the Wi-Fi implementation is going to be handled in this kernel module running within the actual kernel rather than a sort of tightly knit integrated chipset. So let's pop this kernel module into Ghidra and see what we can find. Basically, first things first, we wanted to enumerate the receive functionality, generically speaking, of the kernel module. What that really means is we wanted to understand how, when we actually send a raw wireless payload to this device, what specific functions are actually parsing that wireless frame that we're sending to it. So effectively, what we did was really just use a bunch of different techniques and really just basically bin these functions into pre- and post-authenticated functions that we could access. From a pre-authenticated context where we don't necessarily have to worry about authenticating with the router via PSK, and then B, an authenticated context such that we have to know the PSK. Basically, what we found was that MediaTek organizes these functions into sanity functions. So every respective state machine and every respective sort of message handling protocol is handled by these sanity functions. Lastly, the Sonos machine does support its own AP mode, but for all intents and purposes, we focused on analyzing this device as a client. So let's jump straight into the bug. So long story short, after looking and auditing all of these functions, one function in particular definitely stood out, and that was this WPA parse EAPOL key data, or EAPOL key data for brevity's sake. So what we can see here, as far as if we can kind of highlight some key portions here, we see that key data, the second parameter, even though it is technically, as we'll see here in a bit, technically a decrypted key data that's being decrypted by the actual client itself, it's effectively just a series of information elements. And for those of you unaware of what an information element is, it's really just the basic data structure comprised of a 1 byte type of, as far as the Wi-Fi type that, frame that you're dealing with, a 1 byte length, and followed by the actual value in and of itself that usually corresponds to the length that you specify. So the issue here, if you haven't already spotted it, is the fact that there's really no input validation. The length that you see on the first red arrow, key data, or really just the length field again, is being assigned to KDE-len. Then it's just being subtracted by 6, no questions asked. Then it's being assigned to GTK length on the second red arrow. And then after that, there's a nice little mem move, which for those of you unaware, and this is basically just a buffer overflow. And because GTK buff is initialized on the stack and it's 32 bytes, and if you don't control the length, that's your classic stack buffer overflow. So also, I should also mention that there's no max validation on GTK length. Cool. So sort of an overview here. We see that key data is really just a bunch of information elements being processed by a while loop. Not pictured here, but it's basically just the while loop indiscriminately parsing information elements. Technically, if we got GTK length to be maybe 255, we can trigger a really large copy that would then overflow GTK buff, and that would basically allow us to do an overflow. So let's cross-reference this function and see if we can actually trigger it, right? We found a bug, but can we actually trigger the bug? So first things first, WPA message sanity. So again, these sanity functions is really just the parent function that handles a bunch of WPA message parsing. And what that means is effectively, sort of fast forwarding here, we could have effectively triggered this via a sort of outdated or deprecated use of WPA using TKIP. But we chose to use WPA2 just to be a little bit more modern. And from there, we basically sort of surmise that if we establish some sort of WPA2 connection, we should be able to trigger this vulnerable function. Cool. So let's cross-reference from there, work our way up a little bit. Cool. So we can see here that WPA message sanity is effectively being called by these peer-pair message action functions. And for those of you sort of unfamiliar with the actual Wi-Fi protocol implementation, and namely the WPA2 handshake, each one of these functions corresponds to effectively each handshake packet that's traveling around the air just before you actually successfully authenticate or presumably authenticate. So we can see here that we can sort of start to paint a picture of what we need to expect and what kind of attack we need to do to potentially trigger this bug. So what we can do is, rather than just do a normal four-way handshake and pass these information elements around, or pass these wireless packets around up until we associate, is if we back up here a little bit, whoops. We see here, one of the comments that I have here is that we're decrypting incoming data on message 3. That's typically where the GTK or the global temporal key is usually installed. So it's usually passed around at message 3 here. So sort of jumping back, what we can do as far as an attack is concerned is maybe we can craft some sort of malicious message 3 in such a way that we can trigger this bug. And a really easy way to do that, as we discovered, was just using WPA supplicants. And WPA supplicant also supports AP mode, which is really useful for us. And that's exactly what we did. We just patched the message 3 portion of that code, and we were basically able to trigger the bug. So before we actually show you the output of whether or not we were successful in actually triggering it and controlling the registers that we thought we controlled, let's go over the actual stack layout. We can see here that basically the main vulnerable function has a stack frame size of about hex 140. We can see that the vulnerable buffer is about SP plus 70, hex 78. And if we triggered our overflow, basically an uncontrolled length, that could presumably mean that we leak over and start corrupting the parent stack frames, the parent stack frame. So we can do some simple math here. If this information element can only be 255 bytes big, and we know the stack frame size of the vulnerable function, we can basically just subtract where that buffer starts by the actual stack frame itself, which results in basically hex C8 bytes until we actually start, or until we cross the boundary into the parent stack frame's calling function. And that leaves us with about hex 37 bytes. So since this is a 64-bit implementation, it's about 7 registers. So let's send it, and it looks like we actually hit something. We got kernel panic output on UART. That's great. And it looks like we control the registers that we think we do, that we thought we did, rather. We control the PC. We control X19 through X23, so effectively 7 registers. There's a lot more detail to be covered here, and I implore you to read the white paper associated with this. But long story short, we did basically control a complete 7 registers rather than basically an almost 7 registers, in the sense that the MSB of X23 was always set to FF, which for all intents and purposes was useful for us, since we ended up using it as a sort of an address gadget. Also, we did cause some downstream corruption, but we ended up mitigating that with by adding additional information elements, such that when the while loop effectively just indiscriminately parsed these information elements, we were able to reiterate that while loop and avoid downstream corruption. So, okay, well, we can trigger the bug, but how do we exploit this, given that we only have 7 registers? And at the time, Alex was really interested in exploiting this and gaining control of the device as fast as possible, in the sense that if this were a Pontone entry, we want this to be A, reliable, and B, fairly quick. So we kind of came up with a wild idea. What if we got RCE in one packet? Is that even possible? And if that is possible, how do we do that with 7 controlled registers? And even if we do that, does the entire actual payload, as far as additional ROP gadgets and shellcode, fit? Secondly, once we control the device, what is, I guess, handshake failure, in the sense that if we want to take control of the device and we're trying to avoid downstream corruption, which then induces handshake failure, how do we recover from that? Do we just reconnect? Next, as far as overview of these ideas is concerned, let's go over the actual, I guess, architecture of the wireless packet that we're dealing with in general. So we know roughly that WPA2, in terms of max packet size according to spec, is around 2K bytes, or around 2,300 bytes. And next, sort of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge situation here. If we were to get a reference to this wireless frame that we're sending as a payload to this client, so if we were able to get some sort of pointer, how can we manipulate this wireless frame to include additional data? Well, maybe we can use unused parameters in this frame, maybe like the key RSE or key ID, to inject additional addresses at that location and offset. Next, even though our payload is included as encrypted key data, there's nothing really stopping us from appending additional unencrypted data, such that when we get a reference to this wireless frame payload in memory, we can use that for additional ROP gadget space and subsequently shellcode as well. So let's go over the actual stack layout and how we ended up manipulating that to make additional room, such that we can do a little bit more rather than just control only 7 registers. Some considerations to sort of review here. We don't have KSLR, which means deterministic gadget offsets. Stack canaries aren't enabled, which is great, because we basically just control the PC, as we've seen. But we do have to deal with a non-executable heap. So from there, as far as useful things to consider. By the time we hit this vulnerable function, we're going to corrupt the calling stack frame's function epilogue and registers that are associated with it. And what ends up happening there is effectively right before we pop and hit our vulnerable or controlled PC, we end up setting our stack pointer to the WPA message sanity's calling parent function. And at that point, from a crash context, the second we crash, a very useful pointer exists about hex 18 above us that is literally just pointing to the wireless frame payload that we were talking about. So with that in mind, let's go over the exploitation strategy in general. So first, we'll prioritize acquiring that EA pull pointer from memory. We'll use some additional space that we created in that initial overflow and treat that as some initial sort of drop gadgets that we injected rather than just use it as scratch space, which gives us a little bit more breathing room. Next, presumably, we'll be able to then basically issue a bunch of ROP gadgets, hit trigger our shellcode, and take control of the device. The next thing we have to worry about is continuation of execution, which is really just cleaning up, make sure we don't crash the device, and basically enabling post-exploitation steps at that point. The only thing after that is really just initiating the handshake normally after that, such that we can control over WAN and basically do some post-exploitation fun stuff after that. So let's do a sort of review of how we turn 7 registers into effectively a fully controlled stack wirelessly. This is sort of a non-exhaustive review of key gadgets that enabled us to do that. So firstly, we need to retrieve that EA pull pointer from memory. Easy enough. Next, again, as previously mentioned, we just adjust the stack pointer to point to the beginning of our overflow payload such that we give ourselves a little bit more breathing room. Next, we prioritize saving the stack pointer. This is going to help for continuation of execution. Lastly, all we need to do, since we have a reference to the EA pull pointer, is just adjust where we're pointing in that pointer to point to the additional ROT payload and shellcode that we were talking about. And then lastly, just find one last gadget and solidify the fact that we now have a fully controlled stack at that point. One thing to note, though, we have a non-executable heap, so we have to deal with that. So how do we deal with that? So we have this. We have the fact that we don't have KASLR enabled, which means, again, deterministic offsets. And if we have the kernel image, all we really have to do is load that into something like Ghidra or IDA, enumerate the functions that we're interested in, and start using those basically as we see fit. One function in particular allowed us to basically very easily set the heap as executable, which was setMemoryX. And all we really do is just use setMemoryX in the sense that we just provide the EA pull pointer that we just previously got to setMemoryX, and we basically have an executable heap at that point. So next thing, we have the fact that we have control of the device, at least the initial portions of it. But what do we do after that? How do we actually gain control of the device from a holistic sense if we wanted to maybe execute shell commands or maybe create a reverse shell, something like that? Well, we can use a sort of very popular, at least an anecdotally popular API known as a call user mode helper. And long story short, what that enables us to do is just issue shell commands from a kernel context. The only thing we need to do is just make sure that we don't kill or block that thread, rather, and we don't jam, basically set it as non-blocking. And we can be smart and reuse existing code that's in the kernel that specifies an EMVP or environment variables for us, which basically allows us to execute shell code, or shell commands remotely, I should say. But what happens after that? What do we do? Do we just create a remote shell? That's basically where post-exploitation comes into play, and I'll leave Alex to talk about that.
Thank you. So yeah, basically for post-exploitation, and Sonos has implemented some protections, so it's not just as straightforward as just dropping a binary and then executing it. They've implemented protection against remounting the partitions as executable, and that's implemented within the kernel itself. So, but because we've got kernel mode code execution, with our shellcode, we can basically locate the, there's a kernel variable which essentially states whether partitions are allowed to be remounted as executable or not. So when the system boots up, it essentially sets this to be 0, so it can do that, but then, sorry, it's set to 1, but then when it boots up, it's set to 0, so you can't remount the partitions as executable. But we can just basically patch that back to being 1, and that gives us executable binaries. So what binaries do we drop? Well, Sonos have actually removed common things like busybox telnet from the device itself, but we can drop our own compiled busybox to the device. But the next challenge we have is that the etc. file system is also mounted as read-only, and we haven't managed to crack the shadow file password, the shadow file password hash. And ideally, we want to be able to change that, use a known hash value for a password we know, and then use that in busybox telnet. So what we do is we mount the partition as a bind mount, and essentially a copy of the etc. file system, put our own hash in there, and execute busybox, which we've just dropped onto the device itself, and at that point, remount the partitions as executable, which we're now allowed to do because we patched it in the kernel, and run telnet. So that would give you a shell on the Sonos devices, but ideally we wanted to do something more interesting. We want to be able to demonstrate impact and do a cool demo. So we thought it would be really cool if we could capture audio from the device, so all physical, all audio within the proximity of the Sonos device. So we did some research into how the Sonos microphones work and how the audio capture works. And it turns out it was just using the Linux ALSA sound architecture. And I did some reverse engineering of the shared libraries for that. Well, Sonos' libraries, which were using that, and found out that there was a microphone capture device which could be used. But when I started capturing, there was no actual data from the captures. I was like, oh, that's kind of strange. I wonder what's going on here. But it turns out that Sonos had likely muted the microphones by default, and it was necessary to open a handle to their microphone and then issue an unmute to actually gain capture of the audio data. So we can just demonstrate that now with arecord, one of the ALSA utilities, to capture the data. Now, this is cool. We can do that by the command line, but ideally we wanted to develop a custom implant as well. So we developed an implant in Rust, so this could be done remotely as well. So I've got a demo of this, which hopefully should work. It's got sound in the demo, so.
This is our physical setup. On the left, we have an alpha card, which is going to be used to run the malicious access point, which the Sonos device will connect to. On the right, we have the Sonos device, which we'll be exploiting. Now, these devices are physically close, but this attack can be performed over the full range of Wi-Fi. We're going to be using WPA supplicant. WPA supplicant is the perfect tool to quickly test theories out and can be used to change the E8P poll message 3 logic to include our malicious information element. From here, we would assume that the Sonos device has already been provisioned to associate to the access point, or the attacker would know the PSK at which the Sonos device was connecting to. On the left side, we have our patch WPA supplicant, or rogue access point, which is going to deliver the exploit to the Sonos once the device connects. On the right side, we basically have a simple HTTP server listening, which when the exploit triggers, then we will see a connect back. Now we can see the Sonos device is connected and the exploit has triggered successfully. As previously mentioned, the exploit will trigger an underflow when calculating the key length from the malicious EAP poll frame and lead to a stack buffer overflow. We build out ROP payloads, as previously mentioned, and do packet construction, sending the malicious information element in order to trigger the vulnerability. We also add extraneous data to the packet to allow for more space for the ROP and shellcode payload. Once the exploit is triggered, we need to allow for the EAP poll four-way handshake to complete successfully by resorting to the normal AES payload. We also need to make sure that our exploit has continuation of execution to ensure that the device does not panic. Now on the right, we can see that our payload is being triggered and the ROP and shellcode is being executed successfully. We can see it pull down the implant.sh script and execute it, which fetches our post-exploitation tooling. Finally, we can see that BusyBox telnet has been executed, and we can now telnet into our device to gain an interactive shell. We list the file system and we cat a file to demonstrate the version number. Now we can see that the Sonos implant has been installed on the device, and we can click the Start Microphone Capture to record any audio within the vicinity of the device. So now I've started the audio capture on the implant. All the audio within the room should now be captured. So if I'm speaking into the device, it should be recorded. Now we can click Download Microphone Capture on the UI of the implant, and this should now download the microphone capture. Now we can play back the audio which we've captured and downloaded from the device. So now I've started the audio capture on the implant. All the audio within the room should now be captured. So if I'm speaking into the device, it should be recorded. As you can see, we've captured our audio from the microphone.
Thanks. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk about Sonos One and the Wi-Fi exploitation. We've now got a second part of the talk, which is looking at the Sonos's more recent device, which is the Era 100, and a secure boot bypass which on this. So just some background, as Robert said, we originally started doing all this Sonos research for Pwn to Own. We were trying to compete at Pwn to Own, but Sonos released a new device halfway through, like as we were doing our research, and the new device, the Era 100, became the target at Pwn to Own. And it turned out that the exploit which we'd just written wouldn't work on the Era 100 because it was using a different Wi-Fi driver, which was a bit of a shame, but so we started looking at the Era 100 instead. Now, this research as well, it was performed with by Ilya Zurilev. He found some of the secure boot bypass bugs while he was previously working at NCC, but unfortunately he's no longer with NCC. So the issues have now they've been fixed by Sonos as well. They got fixed at the same time as the Wi-Fi vulnerability was patched on the Sonos One. So the secure boot bypass, how this works is that basically we first located the UART on the board to get some kind of information gathering. We located it with the Amlogic's S767, which is a very similar device to the previous Sonos One. And Blasty had created some tools previously for downloading OTA updates and decrypting the updates. But the open source version of these tooling, it only supported the Sonos One devices and Generation 1. So I added support to this to download the Generation 2 Era 100 images. But we had a problem that we weren't able to decrypt these OTA images because they're using keys which are only accessible within the ARM EL3 environment, which we didn't have at this point. So the research progressed by we thought we were going to start by looking at the emmc on the device, on the Era 100. And it turns out it's mostly encrypted. They've also got secure boot implemented in there. But we really wanted to be able to modify the eMMC and be able to test changes and try experiments and so on. So that we didn't really want to be like desoldering and resoldering all the time because it's kind of a slow process. So we were trying to enable eMMC in-circuit programming. So to do this, we only really need to identify the CMD, the clock line, and the data line from the eMMC. And these weren't marked on the silk screen on the PCB. So to do this, we basically probed the termination resistors and the test pads near the eMMC to the sock to determine whether to try locate these using a logic analyzer. And from our logic analyzer captures, we could see that the clock signal, that was pretty obvious because it was a repeating clock signal. And command we could find, but the data lines and so on weren't super obvious. So from this, we could basically identify 3 out of 4 of the data pins. We only really need one data pin, .0, for actually doing 1 bit read and write. And so yeah, we can use a logic analyzer. We can attach to these locations, and we can see where the data, which has first got the data on, and that's the .0. The other problem we had was that the eMMC talks to the sock, and there's some interference because we're powering it from the sock itself. So, and so we needed to keep the device held in the boot ROM as well. So to do this, we located the int pin. As you can see, it was a bit of like fine soldering, fine micro soldering to do this. So the issues which were identified, the first issue was like Sonos are using like a hardened U-boot implementation. They've actually done quite a few rounds of hardening because people have found vulnerabilities in the U-boot before. They've locked it down with a password. They've restricted the commands. They've removed dangerous commands and so on from it. We had the plain text from the Sonos One device, and our hypothesis was that the U-boot would be very similar on the Era 100. It would likely be the same code base. Yeah, because it's encrypted using, the Era 100 one is encrypted using keys within the EL3, which we don't have at this point. So looking at the UART output, Ilya identified that there was an error message which basically said bad CRC output using default environment, which is basically showing that it's trying to load the U-boot environment from the eMMC. And they haven't defined this config env equals no variable when building the U-boot. So that means we can set the boot command in U-boot. So this is what the U-boot chain looks like, the boot chain looks like. Basically, boot command is set to Sonos boot, and then Sonos boot will call into bootm, and bootm will finally boot the Linux kernel and boot into the Linux kernel. So Sonos boot is custom code by Sonos, which is there to validate and is used to validate the kernel and pass it on to bootm. And then bootm uses this U-boot environment and passes it to the Linux kernel before booting the Linux kernel. But there was a vulnerability here where in Sonos boot, the setenv function wasn't validating its return code. So you could basically, but how do we actually exploit this? Well, there's a little unknown feature of U-boot, which allows you to set the boot args to be read-only. You can use boot args :SR, and that basically it marks them as read-only, and then this will make the setenv fail, which would potentially allow us to set our own boot args. So when Sonos boot proceeds into bootm, we can now control the boot args passed to this and the Linux kernel. But we really want code execution, and we want code execution in the kernel context. So to do this, we can use the initRD functionality and specify initRD equals an address and a size. But we have a problem because we don't know where we can store, what address we can store our custom initRD at. So Sonos have implemented a custom image header. And in this custom image header, it's always located at a fixed address. And in the custom image header, it's got like a structure defining the magic bytes, the version, and this thing called the kernel offset. But the kernel offset, it's normally 0x40, but it's not actually trusted. It's not actually validated as part of the secure boot implementation. So if we can set this kernel offset to be something else, then maybe we can inject in the init at this fixed location. And this is what we did. We basically increased the kernel offset, put it into the slack space, reflashed it to the eMMC using our in-circuit programming, and that way all the signature checks and the secure boot checks still validated correctly. So this is a demo of the secure boot bypass as well. I think this is playing. So normally when the device boots up, you would get UART output, but then when it boots in, there wouldn't be a shell. It would stop at after U-boot, and we can basically see now we've got a root shell from our init as well. And inside of our init we've created a custom driver, and we're now loading this custom driver, which was based on Blasty's previous presentation at Hack in the Box. And we've just recompiled it for the ERA 100. And this is to exploit EL3, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So now we've got kernel mode to code execution and on the ERA 100 persistently across boots, across the device. So the final thing is thank you. The final thing is EL3 exploitation. So Blasty found a way to exploit the EL3 secure monitor mode implementation on the Sonos One devices. When we bought the ERA 100, it turned out it was actually still vulnerable to this. The factory device out of the box, which we purchased from the store. So Sonos had patched this, but it was, but because we hadn't connected our device to do the updates and so on, it was still vulnerable. We needed to update the offsets for the exploit, for the ERA 100, and then at this point we were able to dump the OTP memory and the cryptographic keys used for decrypting the OTA firmware updates as well, and then use my modifications to the Sonos tool to decrypt the firmware updates. So in conclusion, I would say Sonos devices have a pretty good level of security, a pretty decent level of security. They do have things like secure boot. They do have disk encryption. I've definitely seen a lot of embedded devices out there and IoT devices which don't have these kind of controls, are not as robust. They're learning from their past mistakes from hardware and software as the product evolves. There was hardware attacks in the past. Synactive found some vulnerabilities, found a vulnerability where you could replace the Wi-Fi card, the PCIe Wi-Fi card, and then do DMA attacks to actually gain code execution. They've hardened U-boot. They've continually been adding mitigations. So the security is evolving, which is good. OEM security is really important because, as you can see, we found vulnerabilities in MediaTek drivers. And these were MediaTek drivers which were missing mitigations. So they need to be of the same standard as first-party security on devices as well. The updates were patched quickly, to Sonos's credit. They patched the vulnerabilities within a couple of months. They're obviously serious vulnerabilities, so they got the patches out. We don't really know how many devices run the MediaTek chipset. MediaTek pushed out patches to their OEM partners, but we haven't done a study on what other devices are there and vulnerable. And yeah, and just finally, pretty much the majority of Sonos devices were affected by the U-boot issues because it was a shared code base and shared security boot implementation across the devices. And yeah, just a shout out to Sonos as well, because the communication was friendly, responsive. It's good to work with vendors who do take stuff seriously. So yeah, thank you. Are there any questions? Or you can come see us afterwards if you're shy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.